All right, thank you for joining us this afternoon. So welcome to our Asbestos Awareness webinar. So thank you again for joining us. It's really great to see some familiar faces in the list of attendees today. So my name is Jennifer Dick. I'm a certified occupational health nurse and work as a prevention consultant here at Safe Work Manitoba. And I am presenting with Mike today.
So hello everybody, I'm Mike Pogorzellic and I'm a certified health and safety consultant and work at Safe Work Manitoba. I'm a prevention consultant here. We also have Mike Buello on with us. He'll be looking at the chat. So if you have any questions around asbestos or anything about this webinar, feel free to reach out to him. He has a broad background in asbestos and asbestos abatement, and he's a certified industrial hygienist, and he works as a portfolio leader here at Safe Work Manitoba. So let's get started. So as I mentioned, if you have any questions, we have the chat function enabled, so you feel free to use that. If we don't have time to answer your questions today, we can follow up with you, and we'll also try to address some questions near the end. And with that, I'll pass it on to Jen to start the webinar.
All right, thanks, Mike. So we do have just a short disclaimer for you this afternoon. So this webinar is really intended to provide some general guidance with respect to the management of asbestos and the accidental disturbance of asbestos. So this webinar will cover asbestos regulation, in addition to some best practices, which is outlined in the Guide for Asbestos Management, which is found on our website. It's not meant to provide any exhaustive asbestos repair or abatement or sampling requirements, but it's really looking at best practices that's kind of beyond the scope of this webinar. So what we do ask is that you do not remove asbestos yourself and you hire a competent professional. So we do have quite an agenda for you today. We know that asbestos is a hazard, and today we really want you to leave with a good understanding of what asbestos is and how it can hurt you. So you're going to hear about asbestos-related illnesses, as well as what it means when we talk about an asbestos inventory or a control plan. So, and then we're going to end the webinar with some top tips around asbestos. So let's get started. And we're going to start with the question, what is asbestos? And so when we talk about asbestos, it's really actually referring to a group of naturally occurring fibrous mineral silicates. So asbestos is really the generic name given to a number of those commercially significant naturally occurring silicates. And a silicate is a compound that contains both silicon and oxygen. And these silicates are incombustible, and they do separate out into sublight microscopic fibers. When we look at asbestos, it can be found as the fibrous form of croxidolite, amosite, chrysotile, anthophyllite, actinolite, or tremolite, or it can be a mixture of any of those materials. And why asbestos is something that was used is because it's really durable. It's strong, it's heat resistant, it's chemical resistant, and these properties were the reasons why asbestos was incorporated into many products and why it was widely used up until about the 1990s. However, we did find out that there is a correlation that was made where workers who are working with asbestos developed severe long-term health consequences, and that were often fatal. So this eventually led to the ACGIH, or the American Conference of Governmental Industrial Hygienists, and the IARC, which is the Agency for Research on Cancer, to recognize that all forms of asbestos are carcinogenic to humans. And in 2018, Canada actually signed the prohibition of asbestos and products containing asbestos into regulation. And that regulation prohibits the import, sale, and use of asbestos, in addition to the manufacture, import, and sale of products containing asbestos. So let's take a look at some stats. According to the Burden of Occupational Cancer in Canada project, which is found in Carrick's Canada, approximately 1,900 lung cancers and 430 mesotheliomas are the result of an asbestos exposure each year. That's very significant. And we look at current asbestos-related diseases associated with exposures that could have occurred 10 to 40 years ago. So there's a really large latency period between exposure and between disease onset. And in Manitoba specifically, from 2011 to 2020, 33% of the 260 fatalities accepted by the WCB were due to asbestos-related lung diseases. And you can find more of those stats on our website in the Manitoba Workplace Injury and Illness Statistics. So year after year, diseases related to asbestos exposure is the leading cause of death for Manitoba workers. So to get us started on a little bit more of this information, we're going to share a video that talks about the history of asbestos, some sources of asbestos, and the impact that it has on health.
There's been unnecessary deaths as a result of this, and that is going to continue for a period of time to come.
It is a very good building material. There's no question about it. The only problem is now we've discovered that it kills people.
Building trades workers, construction workers, millwrights, engineers, or just production workers who happen to be around the material when it starts to disintegrate or when there's a repair being done are exposed.
There was enough evidence out there decades ago to put a stop to using these products. Why they would have a mineral like that going into homes and schools and hospitals doesn't make any sense.
The hazard is asbestos, and the danger is breathing in the fibers when they're released into the air. Older homes and buildings can have many asbestos-containing materials, such as vinyl tile flooring. These tiny fibers become airborne during renovation or demolition and become deadly.
Prior to 1978, it was a free-for-all. Use it any way you want. You know, when I started in the early 70s in one of the petroleum plants up in northern British Columbia, I was openly working with asbestos dressed the way I am right now. I mean, other than a hard hat and a pair of gloves. No respiratory protection, no coveralls, no containment, none of that stuff. My task was to take finishing cement off the existing tanks and save it because it wasn't available. You couldn't buy it anymore. Maybe that was the first indication there was some problems.
It's in a lot of building products that were used in industry and in commercial buildings. And people may not believe it, but it's also present in a lot of building products used in houses.
Early 70s, I was doing some home renovation in an old house we had on the east side of Vancouver, and part of that renovation was to sand off an old chimney coming up through the ceiling so it would look, nice. And I'm like an idiot sanding it with power equipment, right, to get the old mortar off, how it sticks on the brick. You want to see the red brick. Mortar was full of asbestos, and it was in clouds in my kitchen for a week while I was wearing a little paper mask. So I was heavily exposed then. I don't know what will happen to me. I'm hoping that nothing, as I get older, but that's a typical thing. I mean, I didn't think about it.
If you go and tear something out that's got asbestos in it and you get fibers released and you don't know how to clean up properly and you don't know how to dispose of it properly, you're not only putting yourself at risk, you're putting your other household members at risk, your kids and what have you.
When a worker breathes in, asbestos fibers flow down the air passages deep into the lungs. Immune system cells try to break down the asbestos fibers and become damaged and die. Scar tissue forms around the dead cells. Asbestos fibers can remain in the lungs for long periods, and the scar tissue that results continues to develop for many years after exposure. Eventually, so much scar tissue develops that the lungs stop working.
My dad was very, very health and safety conscious. I know that if anybody had said to him that the products that he was handling could potentially make him sick later in life, he would have taken whatever precautions were necessary. When he retired, without being in any sort of accident or incident, working in a mill and working on high voltage, I think we sort of thought he was safe and that, we didn't have to worry about that part anymore. So yeah, to learn that what he was dying from was a workplace exposure, it was devastating. The frustrating thing was he'd been healthy his whole life. His parents had both lived to late 80s, early 90s. There was no health issues in his family. So he had every expectation of a sort of a long, healthy retirement. So it was hard.
One of the diseases associated with asbestos exposure is mesothelioma. Mesothelioma is a cancer, but it's a cancer of the lining of the internal organs of the body. So you've got a lining of your lungs and you've got a lining of internal organs in your main body cavity, and this is where this particular cancer hits. If you're going to work on your house, if you're going to disturb this stuff, there are ways of doing it safely, but you have to make an effort to find out what those are. It can be in your ceiling, it can be in your drywall, it can be in your floors, it can be in your attics. Don't just have somebody in and tear this stuff out without taking the appropriate precautions, because you put yourself at risk, you put your family at risk, and the contractor is at risk.
Asbestos disease is the #1 killer of workers in BC. If you're working on an older home or in the renovation or demolition industry, always test for asbestos and only remove it if you are trained and qualified. For more information about asbestos, go to worksafebc.com.
There are many products that contain asbestos, and so many health impacts, and we're going to talk about those today. So when we look at the types of asbestos, there are 6 types that we know about. So they're divided into 2 groups, and the most commonly used and most abundant form is chrysotile asbestos. And this is the one that's white in color, and it belongs to the serpentine group. The serpentine form, that consists of more fibers that are curly or appear coiled when you look under a microscope. The other 5 types of asbestos belong to the amphibole group, and these fibers they belong to this group because they form more thin or straight or needle-like, and you saw one of those on the video. And these ones include crucidolite or blue asbestos, and this was commonly found in spray-on applications. You might find amosite or brown asbestos, which is found in pipe insulation. And the remaining 3 forms, which are anthophyllite, actinolite, and tremolite, which can be brown or white or gray in color. And these were not necessarily used commercially, but were really common contaminants found in vermiculite, which we are going to talk about in the coming slides. So let's talk about why asbestos is a hazard and why it's hazardous to us. And this is, when we look at exposure to asbestos, this can occur through natural means, which is through, say, rock formations or outcrops, or by human means, which is man-made products. It can impact any one of us. So once a fiber is released into the air, the ability of that fiber to deposit in our lungs and result in disease can depend on a few factors. One is the length of the fiber, the diameter, and the chemical composition. So when we look at longer fibers, which can be about 10 to 20 microns, and so quite small, these may cause or can cause fibrosis, but shorter ones may not. And this is because the body is not able to get rid of the longer fibers. Alternatively, if you look at fibers of 0.3 microns in diameter and 5 microns in length, these ones tend to appear more active. So other factors is the concentration of the fibers inhaled. So how many fibers are in the air that are being inhaled, the frequency of the exposure, so how often, and the duration of exposure. So this typically, when we look overall, the longer the exposure, the higher the risk. However, some conditions are shorter duration, but high exposure. So it's really dependent on the type. So let's look at we heard some in the video about some asbestos-related illnesses, but let's take a little look further into the lungs. And if we're to look at the lungs, we know that the primary function of our lungs is to oxygenate our blood and to remove carbon dioxide. And if you remember in that video, the structures of the lungs, we see oxygen is brought in via the nose or the mouth. It moves down our trachea, through the bronchi, so that tube that goes into the lungs, and then into the alveoli. So when we look at exposure to asbestos, the scar tissue formation is due to the inability of the body to break down that fiber and to then remove it. So respirable fibers, so smaller than that 0.5 microns in size, can bypass our mucous membranes and reach that deep lung tissue. So over time, the body develops a scar tissue around that fiber to protect the affected tissues. And scar tissue development results in the lung tissue becoming stiff. And when it becomes stiff, it means that there can be less oxygen transfer to the blood, which is again one of those primary functions of our lungs. So we know that the diseases associated with asbestos can be very latent, so long periods of time between, but can cause numerous diseases. And when we look at these diseases, typically they present with difficulty breathing, coughing, or weight loss. And many of these, unfortunately, are irreversible, often fatal, and there really is no effective treatment. So when we look at these exposures, what we see is there's a couple that we'll talk about today. The first one is asbestosis. And what asbestosis is a serious lung condition that's associated with that scar tissue buildup around that fiber, so that's scarring. This is typically a dose-related disease and typically requires a heavy exposure for a long period of time. The second is mesothelioma, and we heard about this one on the video. This is a malignant mesothelioma. It's typically aggressive and often fatal. It's a cancer of the mesothelial cells that form that lining of the lung. And this is typically caused, but not exclusively, by the exposure to cracitylate. So high exposure for short durations have been sufficient to cause a mesothelioma, and this is often a very long latency period. So a very long time between the time you're exposed to the time you develop the disease. But unfortunately, once it's diagnosed, it's often fatal within months. We've also heard of benign pleural diseases, which is more of a disease of the lung that does not cause cancer. And then others are bronchial carcinomas, and that's the lung cancer that can develop usually following a prolonged exposure to asbestos. It can also result in diseases of our larynx, so that's the area of the throat that contains the vocal cords, or ovarian cancers. We've also seen stomach or colon cancers, and these have actually occurred following inhalation exposures. So I'm going to pass it over to Mike to give us to continue to talk about some of the sources of asbestos.
Okay, so thanks, Jen, for providing that great introduction on asbestos and the health effects of asbestos. So now we're going to move into the sources, and we're going to get into some of the legislation when it comes to asbestos, specifically from an awareness perspective. We're not going to really talk about abatements or sampling. That's beyond the scope of this webinar. We're strictly going to be just focusing on that asbestos awareness. So as mentioned previously, asbestos is a durable material that has a high tensile strength, and it's resistant to heat and chemicals. And because of those characteristics, that's why it was used commonly in multiple amounts of material. It just gave that material that chemical resistance, that heat resistance. It was often found in fireproofing and those kind of materials. It was also used as binding agents, especially in cement or plastic, used as thermal insulation in pipes or around pipes. Used quite a bit in interior finishes, such as in walls, ceilings, and floors, and the joint compound that was used on walls. Also, the exterior finishes, so focusing on the roofing, the stucco, the siding could contain asbestos. Mechanical air handling systems, so especially at the joints of these systems, asbestos materials were heavily used. It was often used in vehicle brakes. So again, you need a heat-resistant material when you're applying that to vehicle brakes, and that's why asbestos was used. As I mentioned, fireproofing materials. So if you ever remember in school gyms where you would throw that ball up to the ceiling and that fireproofing would fall down, generally that contained asbestos. And it's often used, or was often used, in flexible fabric duct connections. So if you're ever looking at a ducting system in an old home and you see that white tape around those joints, that does or could contain asbestos. So when we look at the Workplace Safety and Health Act and regs, material containing asbestos is defined as an asbestos-containing material or ACM if it meets the following criteria. So is a friable material containing 0.1% or greater asbestos, is a non-friable material containing 1% or greater asbestos, and is vermiculite insulation that contains asbestos, and we'll talk about vermiculite in the coming slides. So a friable material is a material that easily crumbles with hand pressure. The more friable the material is, the more likely asbestos fibers will be released from the material into the air. A non-friable material is a material that does not easily crumble with hand pressure. However, a non-friable material can become friable if you use power tools on it to create that dust, or if it's left to degrade over time. So for instance, if you have asbestos containing vinyl tile in your home and you decide to use a drill or something on it and you're creating that dust, it will actually release those tightly bound asbestos fibers from that material into the air, and now that material becomes friable. If we look at asbestos containing shingles, shingles are exposed to the elements, so the rain and sun over time. You can get like a powdery type substance that's forms on those shingles, and that's that degradation of that material. And once that material gets degraded, you're getting those once tightly bound fibers starting to be released, and that would now become a friable material. So bottom line, if you're working with a non-friable material that can become friable, just consider them friable materials. Also throughout the webinar, when we talk about asbestos containing materials, we're going to refer to them as ACMs. So now we're going to look at some examples of friable and non-friable materials. So if we focus on friable materials, and remember those are materials that crumble easily with hand pressure. We're talking about ceiling tiles. So again, in older homes, if you look in the basement, commonly used in rec rooms, those tiny square ceiling tiles, often those contain asbestos. Pipe insulation, commonly in workplaces, especially again in those buildings that were built before 1990. If you could see that commonly around pipes, it's that white type of insulation. It could be colored as well. That contained asbestos. Asbestos fireproofing, plaster. So again, those older homes where you have plaster walls, that can contain asbestos, and asbestos containing or contaminated vermiculite. If we look at materials that are non-friable, this would include your vinyl floor tiles. Again, ones used before 1990, any type of adhesives, roof sheeting, or asbestos water pipes and gutters. And these are just some examples. So we were talking about vermiculite earlier, and we'll focus on this now. So this is one that is an issue in Manitoba. So vermiculite itself is a naturally occurring mineral, and it's a light material resembling popcorn. And if you ever go to your home hardware store, you may run into vermiculite. It's often used in gardening. So vermiculite itself is harmless. However, in homes built around in the early 20th century, or throughout actually most of the 20th century, vermiculite was often used as attic insulation and insulation in walls. And the vermiculite that we imported into Manitoba was from Libby, Montana. And the issue with that is there was an adjacent asbestos mining site right beside the mining site where we got our vermiculite from. So it contaminated our vermiculite, and a lot of our vermiculite in those homes before 1990 are contaminated with asbestos. So they're considered a friable asbestos containing material here in Manitoba. And if you have to remove it, don't do it yourself. It's best to hire a trained and competent professional, because it's extremely friable, and just disturbing it a little bit can put big fiber counts in the air and expose you. So next we're going to jump to the legislation. So the Manitoba Workplace Safety and Health Act and Regs, Part 2, 6, 33, 35, 36, and 37 contain provisions requiring owners, employers, and contractors to take specific actions when a potential health risk of asbestos exposure is present in the workplace. So if we look at Part 37, it's of importance because it focuses on the asbestos inventory, which we'll talk about, inspection requirements and labeling, and the control plan, and we'll talk about each of these in the coming slides. There's also Part 36, which covers chemical and biological hazards, and this section contains the requirements around air monitoring when it comes to asbestos fibers. We also have Part 35, which contains information on the requirements around proper disposal of any ACMs. We have Part 33, which contains information on the proper procedures to follow when you're removing ACMs or demoing any buildings that contain ACMs, so your asbestos abatement procedures, which again is beyond the scope of this course. We have Part 6, which contains the requirements around the appropriate PPE to wear, including respirators and appropriate protective clothing if workers are going to be working around or with asbestos. And then finally, we have Part 2, which provides the general duties, including the general safety duties when it comes to safe work procedures around asbestos. So for work involving or projects that involve fiber release or involving removing asbestos containing materials, the director of the Workplace Safety and Health Branch must be notified at least 5 days before beginning work. So that's really important. And if you are interested in more information on the legislation or are interested in a document to help you better understand the legislation when it comes to asbestos, we do have a guideline. So the Safe Work Manitoba Guide for Asbestos Management is a great document, and it helps you understand how to comply with the legislation when it comes to asbestos. So next, we'll focus on the asbestos inventory. So all sites containing ACMs or suspected of containing ACMs require an asbestos inventory. An asbestos inventory should be prepared by a competent person, and this person must have the demonstrated knowledge, experience, and training for recognizing suspected ACMs, performing appropriate sampling techniques when you're trying to sample and test whether or not a material has asbestos, and be knowledgeable in laboratory data interpretation, inventory prep, and reporting. It's important to consider the following when you're preparing an asbestos inventory. So you want to review the site's history, including any previous construction or renovations. You want to perform a complete walkthrough or inspection of the building's interior, so floor by floor, room by room. You want to focus on electrical, plumbing, ventilation equipment, ceilings, walls, floors, any type of sealers or caulking. As I mentioned before, these were materials that often contain asbestos pre-1990. In addition, you want to submit samples of all suspected materials. If you cannot look at asbestos and determine, or look at it as a potential asbestos containing material and determine that it has asbestos in it, the only way to do that is to take a sample and test for it to ensure that it either has or doesn't have asbestos. Because an asbestos containing material looks the same as a non-asbestos containing material. And you also want to prepare a report of findings, including any no findings, and include photographs of ACMs. When ACMs are repaired or removed, the asbestos inventory must be updated. So this is really important. In addition, the owner-employer must perform an annual reassessment on all ACMs to ensure they're in good condition. And copies of any of those records of the inventory and of the annual reassessment must be kept for 30 years from the date the records were made. Also, what's really important is the inventory and these records must be accessible to workers. So if a worker requests them, they must be accessible. So an asbestos inventory must be identified or identify all the locations of the ACMs at your worksite or your workplace whether it's suspected or confirmed. Remember, wherever building materials are suspected to contain ACMs, it must be managed and handled as if they contain asbestos until it's ruled out by sampling. An ACM inventory will include, but not be limited to, the amount of confirmed or suspected ACMs. So you want to include the area they're located and the linear length, so how much of the material exists. The type of ACM, so is it insulation, is it floor tiles? The percentage of asbestos, so how much asbestos is in the material, if known, and the only real way to find that out is through laboratory analysis. You want to list if the material is friable, because that's really important. You want to include the condition of the ACM. So is it in good condition? Is it in fair, poor condition? You want to make sure that if you do have an asbestos containing material in your workplace, that it is contained and is in good condition. If it's in good condition, there's no risk of fiber release and there's no hazard. However, if you have pipe insulation that's punctured or ripped and you have those fibers exposed, that would be considered poor condition and you definitely have a hazard on your hands that needs to be dealt with. You want to include accessibility to the ACM, so can workers reach it? Oftentimes in buildings, because of what I said before, if that material is contained, it can be left in the building. There's no hazard. So what ends up happening is over time and through renovations, you have additional materials that are built on top of that asbestos containing material. And if you don't have that inventory where a worker can determine where that material exists, what can happen is they can drill through that new material, but also drill through that asbestos containing material. And now you have an asbestos exposure on your hands. And what form of asbestos is present? So as Jen talked about, chrysotile, amosite, or crucidolite, just to name a few. What type is it? So once an inventory has been created, the next step is to manage any identified ACMs in the workplace. Asbestos management is required at all sites, as I mentioned, where ACMs are present or suspected to be present. So that is key. You really need to hone in on that. Sites where ACMs are to remain in place. If this is the case, the ACMs must be maintained in good condition, which I mentioned previously, because we want to prevent that fiber release. And this will be accomplished with an asbestos inventory. So that location of that material will be included in the inventory. And there will also be a carefully developed control plan around that material in case it does get punctured or you do have a fiber release. And what do you do in that situation? And that's your control plan, and we'll talk about that. Sites where workers are required to work with ACMs after an accidental fiber release or when performing a large repair. To deal with this is accomplished by following the procedures outlined in the Safe Work Manitoba Guide for Asbestos Management and in your control plan. And sites where workers are required to work with ACMs, as I mentioned, when we're talking about abatements, we're not going to get into that. So look at the Guide for Asbestos Management if you want any information on it. We're pushing that if you don't remove it yourself, you want to hire a trained and competent person to remove it, just to reduce your chance of exposure and exposing others at your workplace. So once it's determined that the ACMs are present or suspected, so you have your inventory in place, you also need, and you're managing it, you also need your asbestos control plan. And it must be developed and implemented prior to any maintenance, renovation, or repair or demos that occur at your work site. And as I mentioned before, the control plan is really there, or is developed to prevent the release of asbestos fibers, again, by minimizing that disturbance of that material. And also it's there in case you have an accidental fiber release. So it's the procedures on what to do if that happens. These objectives are achieved by maintaining those ACMs in good condition, implementing those control measures, and following that control plan. You need to ensure that it's updated and revised as necessary until all the ACMs are removed from your building. So if you don't have asbestos in your building, you do not need an asbestos inventory or an asbestos control plan. So an asbestos control plan should include but not be limited to the following. So it should include the roles and responsibilities of personnel involved in the actions to manage ACMs at the site, periodic and long-term actions put in place to protect the health and safety of workers and others, so any type of contractors or occupants that occupy the building. In addition, procedures to be followed in the event of fiber release and written procedures for ACM repairs and or working near ACMs. It also needs to include the inventory and its location. Remember, that needs to be accessible to workers. Description on how ACMs will be labeled or identified. So if you are going to leave ACMs alone in your building and they are in good condition, they definitely need to be labeled and identified. Description of how and when periodic inspections of ACMs will be performed. And again, that needs to be done on an annual basis. Training requirements for asbestos awareness. So this includes for workers and supervisors. And really the objective of that is to ensure the workers and supervisors recognize what ACMs may be present or suspected and know to ask the employer about the asbestos containing material inventory. It should also contain protocols and training around asbestos waste disposal procedures and any record keeping requirements. So next we'll go on to labeling and signage. So this is part of that inventory and your control plan. And all ACMs must be clearly identified with signs, labels, or other effective means in accordance with Part 37. So other effective means will be workplace and process specific, and workers must be educated and trained for any alternative mode of identification of ACM. So what I mean by that is, for instance, if you're a hotel and you have a lobby that contains asbestos, you're not really going to want to have signage indicating that material is there when you have customers coming in. So if you don't do that, you have to have a system in place where your workers know that that material does exist, and any type of reno or repair shouldn't be done on that material unless it's properly contained. But all that would have to be done through training of your workers, and they would have to be educated on that mode of signage or identification. So when you were looking at warning signs and labels, what they should include is the risks associated with the exposure to asbestos fibers, any cautionary statement to not disturb materials containing asbestos, and cautionary statements with respect to entering an area where repair or renovation activities involving these materials are underway. So if you're having a renovation done and asbestos is there, there definitely needs to be signage on any entrance to that area. ACMs are usually labeled in the form of a posted sign attached directly to the material containing asbestos at the entrance to the area containing asbestos and at entrances to areas where asbestos is being cleaned up or removed. That's generally where signage is utilized. So when we're talking about avoiding exposures to asbestos, workers need to be aware of the location of the suspected and confirmed ACMs, and that's again done through that inventory, and understand their responsibilities and the procedures outlined in their asbestos control plan. So again, inventory identifies the location, the control plan identifies how to avoid an exposure and what to do if an exposure or a release occurs. So bottom line, you do not want to disturb suspected or confirmed ACMs. So for example, do not drill holes into, sand, saw, or grind suspected or confirmed ACMs. You don't want to sweep or dust floors, ceilings, moldings, or other surfaces with a dry brush in an environment containing asbestos. You do not want to use an ordinary vacuum either to clean up debris containing asbestos, because what that does is it just sucks it up and shoots those fibers and contaminates the whole area. You need a HEPA filter in that vacuum to ensure those fibers don't pass through that filter and get distributed to the rest of the space. So bottom line, if an ACM is damaged, you want to ensure it's repaired or removed by a professional or competent person. So what if an accidental release does occur in your organization? Well, you would again focus on that asbestos control plan. When we look at minor fiber release incidents, such as accidental puncture of an insulated pipe or breakage of a corner section of tile or wall panel containing asbestos, these can be treated with standard wet cleaning or HEPA vacuuming techniques, again by that competent worker who's trained to remove or abate asbestos. When we're looking at major fiber release incidents, these are actually considered a serious incident under Part 2.63 of the Workplace Safety and Health Regulations. And if this occurs, so if you're disturbing large amounts of ACMs, this can contaminate an entire building or an entire space, especially if that ventilation system is left on when you're doing that removal. Those fibers get everywhere. And they don't just disappear. They fall to the ground, and then somebody can re-enter that space and kick up those fibers again, and now you have additional exposures on your hand. So it's a big issue. So the event of a major fiber release, the following immediate actions are essential. You want to notify workplace safety and health. The area must be preserved, so you want to isolate the area, post the appropriate warning signs to prevent any unauthorized entry. You want to shut off all air handling systems, and you want to seal the doors, windows, and any air registers with 6 mil polyethylene sheeting and tape, again, to prevent those fibers from being distributed to other rooms. And you want to notify the occupants in the building of the major fiber release. Also, the major fiber release incident must be investigated as soon as reasonably practicable, followed by a written report. So that's super important. So next, I will pass it on to Jen, and she's going to talk about the right to refuse dangerous work around an asbestos event.
All right, thanks, Mike. So just as workers, you need to be aware of your right to refuse dangerous work when your work process involves suspected ACMs or asbestos-containing materials, and when the appropriate protective measures are not in place. So the appropriate steps that to take if you're refusing dangerous work related to asbestos, there's 3 steps. So step 1 is reporting the dangerous condition immediately to your employer, your supervisor, or any other person in charge at that workplace, and giving your reason for refusing that work. If the employer does not correct that dangerous occurrence or dangerous condition, which may include an asbestos-related concern, you would go to step 2. So step 2 involves your health and safety committee, or your worker co-chair or their designate. If the employer does not correct the dangerous condition immediately, the person who received the report of refusal to work must inspect that dangerous condition. And this must be done in the presence of a safety and health committee member or a safety representative. If the dangerous condition is still not remedied, then we would go to step 3. And step 3 involves the workplace safety and health. If the dangerous condition has not been removed, any of the persons present during the inspection may notify a workplace safety and health officer of the refusal to work and the reasons for it. So what do you do if you are exposed? And this is a really important question. We've heard today that all work sites containing asbestos-containing materials and suspected of containing asbestos-containing materials require an asbestos inventory. Mike talked about that earlier. And what we want to reinforce really is if an accidental fiber release occurs at your workplace, what you need to do. And that's the first thing is really notifying your supervisor, so that the workplace can follow the procedures outlined in your organization's asbestos control plan. That's why those plans are so important. It's going to tell you what you need to do to keep workers safe. It's also important to notify WCB to submit a claim. As we've heard, there can be long-term impacts from exposures. One of the main messages from this webinar today is that asbestos is very complex, and I think we've heard that today. Not only are there health effects, but there are also processes that must be followed in any workplace that has asbestos or asbestos-containing materials. We want to ensure that you know that asbestos removal and abatement procedures is beyond the scope of this webinar. But what we really want you to know is please do not disturb or remove asbestos yourself. Any removal or abatement procedures must be done by a competent professional. And really, for more information on asbestos removal and abatement, you can check out the safemanitoba.com website for that guide on asbestos management, or find a consultant who is experienced and competent to discuss the asbestos-related matters. So we really want to leave you with some top tips. So the first one that Mike and I want to leave you with is really ensuring that your company or your workplace has an asbestos inventory if it's suspected and confirmed ACMs are present in the work environment. And really ensure your workers and your supervisors are trained on that inventory so that they're aware of the location of any suspected or confirmed asbestos-containing materials. The second tip is really never proceed with work if any material may be an asbestos-containing material. Review the asbestos inventory to ensure that the material is not an ACM. And if you're still unsure, ask your supervisor any questions to obtain that additional information. And if you're still not satisfied, you have the right to refuse that dangerous work. The third tip is really ensure that workers are trained and understand the asbestos control plan and the roles and responsibilities in the case of an accidental fiber release or exposure. And the fourth, as we've said multiple times today, is please don't remove the asbestos yourself. Hire a competent professional to do that. That kind of concludes our presentation. So we hope you're able to take away some really valuable information this afternoon that'll help to keep you and your workplaces safe. If you have any questions or any additional questions, please don't hesitate to connect with Mike or I. We can hopefully try to answer some of those. And just on behalf of Safe Work Manitoba, thank you for watching and thank you for coming today. Nice to see some familiar names. So we'll hope that you're able to take away some tools and knowledge, increase your awareness of asbestos. In the coming days, you're going to receive an email with a link to a survey. So we just ask if you can complete that survey. We'd be very grateful to have you provide some feedback. And we do take that into consideration when we're developing future webinars. You will be able to see this complete recording on our YouTube channel, and so you will be able to share it with your colleagues. So please be sure to visit safemanitoba.com. There's lots of resources there, and you can learn even more about asbestos and how to keep yourself and your workplaces healthy and safe. So thank you again. We really appreciate you being here.
Great. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.